Hello, David McMillan here, and I'm in London, where few people in this city could possibly have missed the events last Friday of an attack by Usman Khan at London Bridge, in which he stabbed fatally two young people and injured several others. There's been a lot of talk about the attack, and is there any point me adding to it? Well, as a former smuggler, I've spent far too long in too many prisons, some in the Far East, some in dungeons, and quite a few in the West, where I met people like Usman Khan. But I should go back further, perhaps to Afghanistan, when I met the young guys who were the forerunners to what became the Taliban. They were just kids in the Soviet-administered Afghanistan at the time, which had young women going to high school, and it was very westernized. These tribal guys, they resented these girls. They felt like they were somehow missing out. And of course, they were very much sexually repressed. So, of course, they viewed them as harlots. And that built up a resentment. Now, you might feel, what's that got to do with joining a terror group? Well, through some imagined sense of injustice and inadequacy, often young people, and a few older ones, will turn to some welcoming group of fundamentalists of any kind. Back then, in the late 70s and in the 80s, drawing people in Afghanistan and part of the Taliban was a village issue. It was a local area. But of course, we're beyond the year 2000 and, well, what's called recruitment, but the joining anyway, the sympathies. That takes place remotely, and that's very easy to do. Usman Khan and a few associate imbeciles were convicted, I think, in 2012 of some lame attempt to do some damage up north. They were put in jail and had their sentences, I think, reduced or set anyway at 16 years, so they were released in 8. Usman Khan amongst them. He was required to do quite a number of courses in prison. Now, this is not unusual. They have courses such as enhanced thinking skills, anger management, victim awareness. And I've sat in on a few of those, and those who are awake for them are supposed to keep a diary. So out of a class of about 20 doing these offender management courses, there would be usually a couple who would write out the journal for the other members who really just didn't give a toss. It was just something they had to do to get out. I'm not really surprised that Usman Khan managed to pass all the tests. After all, he joined a group in which repeating something that somebody else had said was important. In the mini madrasa, the Islamic learning colleges of the North, they had to repeat things they didn't necessarily understand. And of course, religions they had no real idea about. These were almost entirely outcasts from their personal society. I don't mean society at large, but they felt failures within their own families, incapable of running dad's business or taking up the uncle's offers of working in the store. They resented too that the women in England were doing so much better, so it was only natural that they'd turn to some welcoming hands. And many did. And to prove that their worth was higher than anybody else's, they would agree to various plots and sometimes gather together and fantasize. Perhaps even take a few steps to demonstrate within the group that they were doing more than the next fellow. I'm saying this because a lot of the, what would you call it, actual steps towards any of these bombings, they don't happen by a central control, but just the competitiveness of individuals within a group. So Usman Khan and the others, they failed in that one, so they had to succeed once in prison. There are many who succeed in prison structures that are not much good in real life. And strangely, the Usman Khan story brings to mind a guy I knew many years ago and I'd met in a Supermax prison in Melbourne, Australia. And I'll say a little bit about Ted Eastwood, the guy in the Supermax, because it rather demonstrates the dedication that somebody can show when putting on a good face in prison. And he didn't start out that way, Ted. Well, he was in there for kidnapping 9 school children and their teacher, demanding $1 million, which the state was happy to pay. In fact, the Premier of the state took the $1 million in cash and was wandering around the bush hoping to give it to Ted. That arrangement fell to pieces when a teacher kicked her way out of a house where Ted had taken them, and managed to alert the authorities. I should say the kidnapping scheme of the school children was not destined to succeed anyway. Apparently, Ted was telling me that when he'd gone into a McDonald's and bought, I think, 20 Happy Meals, people rather made the connection between that and the recent kidnapping of 9 school children. Ted, of course, was imprisoned for that, but of course he wasn't reformed in any way, and the whole idea of reformed in that sense is ridiculous. People either decide to change what they do or they don't. They go on with it. And the idea that Premier of the state was wandering around with $1 million in cash, that stuck with Ted. So he had plans. In fact, he escaped from prison and went at it again. This time, Ted, well, he went for school children again. Obviously, they were the ones who would be paid for. I think he got a small bus load of them. Or no, he picked them up from one of the schools, I think. Anyway, and a truck drove past, so he had to pick them up as well. He had quite a crew. And then he telephoned through his demands. These were a bit better. He'd upped it from $1 million. He wanted $7 million US. He wanted 100 kilos of heroin, 100 kilos of cocaine, some guns, of course, and he wanted the freedom, the release of 16 inmates from prisons. Ted was a guy who likes to make friends, so I guess he didn't want to forget them, though I'm not sure I'd want to be on that list of inmates that Ted handed over at the time. Well, the police weren't having any of it. When that scheme failed, the police picked up Ted, and according to Ted, shook their head and said, well, it's a 2-hour drive back to town, and you won't have to worry about that. They shot him in the chest. Now, when Ted was telling me the story, he said at the time, of course, he heard a loud bang, and they threw him into the back of a car, yet he felt that his leg was wet. Extraordinarily enough, that bullet hit his sternum and spun down through his body, and then came out of his thigh. So the police quite happily and slowly drove back to town, went to the hospital, looking in the back from time to time, and Ted was assuredly playing possum there. And when the door was opened by the emergency treatment personnel, Ted came to life. I'm not dead, said Ted, and the police weren't happy with that. So he was jailed again, and I spoke to him quite a few times in the super. I recall speaking with Ted when he came back in from the exercise yard. Now, the exercise yard in the Supermax was caged. It was concrete from side to side and all very high walls. so there was nowhere to go from there. But as we spoke on the steps, our conversation was a little bit stilted by the fact that Ted was using a small hobby knife to cut his hands deeply and bloodily. I said, Ted, don't go too far. You might hit a couple of main cables. And by the way, what are you doing? And Ted said, well, I just strangled a rapist out in the yard there. I'm getting ready for the court case. The court case came about for the murder of the rapist. Ted showed his bandaged hands, or scarred perhaps they were by then, and claimed self-defense, and he was acquitted. But none of this rapscallion behavior was going to see him get out any time soon. So Ted had to think of another angle, and he struck up a connection with the visiting Christians and the odd priest, not so much the jail priest. You've got to work on an outsider. Only they are the truly naive. And Ted had a little coterie of eager Christians. I mean, these Christians were saving the soul of a kidnapper, a twice kidnapper, a kidnapper of school children. Though, of course, he was quite nice to them, but that's not the point. His publicity was good, and the Christians loved it. This Christianity act up for, it was for months, and staff in the prison tried to crack him a few times, even put informers on his section and tried to get him to admit as much that it was a bit of an act or say anything a bit condemning of the religion. Of course, he didn't crack. He was applying himself this time, as people do in jail, as I'm thinking old Uzi Khan must have done when trying to get through his courses. So I was kind of curious to get a moment alone. Ted and I came across each other in the holding cell. It's this electronic zoo of the Supermax, where they put you into a special suit with a little lock at the top so you can't secrete anything upon your person during the visit, even though often there are officers sitting in on the visit. Anyway, the moment was clear. There were no microphones. Nobody could hear. And I said to Ted, who knew me of old, Ted, this Christianity stuff, how's it going for you? Okay, Dave. Yeah, but Ted, just one thing. It must be tough keeping it up. Ted looked around, scoured around to see if anybody could possibly be listening, and then looked at me and said, yeah, Dave, it ain't easy. But somebody can keep up a pretty good act in prison when they need to. Now, Ted Eastwood had a bit of brains, whereas Uzi Khan is pretty much a moron in many ways. Well, was, till the police shot him the other day. Which, by the way, I kind of think is a unspoken understanding that if an opportunity presents itself where you can justifiably shoot one of these guys, do so. I can understand that. Usman probably got through his courses, his anger management, his victim awareness, and disengagement, I think, was another one. And of course he was released and he was on a tag. And then he came, not under the care, but under the interest of some very earnest and absolutely fine young people, part of a Cambridge University group, I think called Learning Together. Now here's the thing. When he got to near London Bridge, which was a bit uncomfortably close, maybe not such a good day's outing for him, but still uncomfortably close to where a lot of terror action seems to be focused, probably because among those groups, the idea of London, yes, they're in the right city, and a bridge, people walk across the bridge. So put the two things together, you've got yourself a target. That's the thinking, such as it is. Anyway, my point goes to this. Why, of all the people that he had to fatally kill, was it those who were helping him most, those with genuinely held beliefs in peace and wanting to see things go better for him? Why would he kill the people who seemed to care? Over the many years, I've probably come across maybe 10,000 prison inmates, briefly, spoken to more than 500 psychopaths, and live with some complete outcasts. I can say this about those who believe something to be true that not many people do. That is the kind of fundamentalist belief that the Western world is corrupt and evil and needs to be destroyed. Those kind of people don't like anything that directly contradicts that. I don't mean something that's just an argument or a discussion or a bit of evidence that can be drawn from society at large, but I mean they don't like the embodiment of goodness. So that is too much of an embarrassment to handle, that here before him were two people who were proof that he must have been wrong, proof that his beliefs were faulty. I think that's why they sadly became the target. Sooner or later, everybody has to get released from prison, and there are some exceptions to that where they just leave them there until they die. But the idea is that people will be released. Now, how is anybody supposed to predict what they might do? It's certainly not something that's easy to do for somebody who's got a lot of experience. I've seen a lot of people, and could I predict it? I would see danger signs, but I couldn't put them down on paper very easily. And I don't think anybody in the parole office could say, well, I don't know, he's done everything right, but I just don't swallow it somehow, so keep him in. The system doesn't work like that because mostly it'd be wrong if it did. It'd be an error. I mean, their judgments, instinctive, would probably be incorrect in as much as that person might not do anything if released. But this is where it becomes unpredictable. Sure, half-wit, loathsome monobrows like Usman Khan are instantaneously recognizable as somebody who's a misfit. But at the same time, will he do something? Remember, there are 10,000 fantasists who dream of doing something spectacularly and televisably awful and becoming famous. Out of those fantasists, some people run through a bit of a plot. But the combination of events that bring about an actual deed, going about it with a knife, they need to cascade, a bit in the way that they're almost like chance events. It's very hard to dissuade it. Now, those two young people put themselves in danger. I guess they knew that, and they were prepared to take that risk. But, of course, that's part of it. You take that risk, whatever you want to do. The fact is, for people like him, who had his core centered around a faulty Western world, to be in the embrace of kind and thoughtful people, it rather stands to reason that they would be the first to be attacked. There's a lot of talk now about changing the system to do what? To make them jump more hurdles in prison? It won't mean anything. Only perhaps some personal experience in some other land might make a difference. Where to send them? Into some future reality show where they're on a kind of mock Civil War, Syria style? Or, well, the fact is they're just not worth that much effort. Sadly, it was a series of events that just rolled in favour of that particular horrible outcome. But we always feel like we should be able to do something, and pretty much we can't. One thing is for sure, pretty much anything that happens in a prison won't amount to a hill of beans. A person like that, extremists, they really, if you want to keep them alive at all, which is debatable, would need to be taken entirely out of the environment that lets them get together and put into one in which they need to compete in some way to survive on a humane level. That would be quite a vast creation, and certainly one to which our societies are not willing to pay the price. And experience rather than training will help there. It's no solace to be taken from any outcome in this situation, only that it's a rarity. Indeed so rare that the chances of dying in this way are extremely remote. There are so many other ways to die in unfortunate circumstances. We hope there won't be such unlucky people, but there will be. But as I say, it's rare. And perhaps the last word in general on groups that form together, whether for good or for not so good. The protection of religious belief is fine. People can believe whatever nonsense they want. But really, at some point, the state should take the rational view. They cannot forever go on supporting magic. Who knows what, amongst all the Abrahamic religions, might have emerged as the prime text. But all that doesn't mean very much. It's just groups of people getting together. And amongst those groups of people searching for meaning in their lives, behind that is a dissatisfaction. And the religions won't bring it to them, and the state shouldn't suggest that these religions have any real truth behind them. One very small thing that might work in a prison, it sounds trivial, but it would mean something. In some religions, there's a bit of a dress-up. In Judaism, there's some funny hats and things. And, I call them funny. They're not really funny. They're just a bit different. In Islam, people walk around in a shalwar kameez for some reason. It's unconnected with anything I can understand. It certainly doesn't necessarily have any religious connection. And in Christianity, there are many talismans. Now, in a prison, prison uniforms have pretty much gone with the wind. But I think wearing of costumes would be something that should be restricted in prisons. It sounds like an absolute nothing. But when you start putting people in the uniform of their little army, it's a bad step. Sure, let people have a good old preach and a sing-along or whatever it might be, a chant or a mumble. But let's do without the uniforms of that particular force. That only unifies a bunch of people who might not have any credibility other than their particular uniform. Leave it to whatever they want to wear. Variations of the prison uniform always go down well. Perhaps insist that the same uniform is worn for every religious gathering. That might work something. Take the edge off the cause. Bye.